High school was never something I particularly enjoyed. Between the social cliques, endless homework, and general awkwardness of adolescence, I mostly kept to myself. My school, Ridgeview High, was old. Built in the 1940s, it had this eerie, institutional vibe: tall, narrow hallways, creaky wooden floors, and a faint smell of mildew that seemed embedded in the walls. The part of the school that everyone avoided was the third floor, which was mostly unused. Rumor had it that there had been a fire in one of the classrooms decades ago, and ever since, the floor had been deemed structurally unsafe. The doors leading to it were chained shut, but that didn't stop students from making up all kinds of stories about what happened up there: ghosts of old teachers, students who never escaped, even the possibility of a cult hiding out in the ruins. Most of us didn't believe the rumors, but that didn't stop the third floor from giving me the creeps. It was a Thursday when everything started. My English teacher, Mrs. Blair, assigned us a group project that required after-school work. My group consisted of me, a quiet girl named Allison, and two guys, Mark and Trevor. None of us were particularly close, but we agreed to meet in the school library to divide up the work. We worked for a while, but as the afternoon turned to evening, our conversation drifted to other topics, specifically the third floor. "Have you ever actually been up there?" Trevor asked, leaning back in his chair. "No," Allison said quickly, her eyes darting to the library windows. "Why would anyone want to?" Mark smirked. "I heard the janitor still goes up there sometimes. Something about storage." "That's just a story," I said, rolling my eyes. "Nobody's been up there in years." Trevor raised an eyebrow. "Want to bet?" Before I knew it, the four of us were standing in front of the chain doors that led to the third floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows through the cracked windows. "You're insane," Allison muttered, crossing her arms. "If we get caught, we won't," Trevor said, pulling a paperclip from his pocket. He bent it into a makeshift lockpick and started fiddling with the chain. After a few tense moments, the padlock clicked open. "Where did you learn that?" Mark asked, impressed. "Don't worry about it," Trevor said with a grin, pushing the doors open. The stairwell leading to the third floor was dark and dusty, the air heavy with the scent of decay. My stomach twisted with unease, but I followed the others up the creaky steps. At the top, we found a long, dimly lit hallway lined with classroom doors. Most of the windows were boarded up, and the floorboards groaned under our weight. "This is insane," Allison whispered, sticking close to me. "We should go back." "Not yet," Trevor said, shining his flashlight down the hallway. "We've come this far." We walked cautiously, peeking into the empty classrooms. Most were filled with old desks and chairs, their surfaces covered in thick layers of dust. In one room, we found a broken chalkboard with faint writing still visible. "Help us." "That's creepy," Mark said, his voice unusually quiet. "It's just some prank," I said, though my heart was pounding. But then we heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from further down the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Allison whispered, her face pale. "It's probably just the wind," Trevor said, though he didn't sound convinced. We followed the sound to the last room on the left. The door was slightly ajar, and the tapping grew louder as we approached. Trevor pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single desk in the center. On the desk was a metronome, its arms swinging back and forth, producing the tapping sound. "Who set this up?" Mark asked, looking around. Before anyone could answer, the doors slammed shut behind us. Allison screamed, and Trevor yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The tapping of the metronome grew faster, its clicks echoing off the walls. Then, faint whispers filled the air, too soft to make out. "This isn't funny," I said, my voice shaking. "Open the door." "I'm trying," Trevor shouted, pulling harder. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they formed a single, chilling word. "Leave." The metronome stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, slithered along the walls, growing larger as it approached. "What is that?" Allison cried, backing into the corner. The shadow took shape, forming a tall, humanoid figure with glowing eyes. It stretched toward us, its long, spindly arms reaching for the door. "Get it open!" Mark shouted, pounding on the wood. With a final heave, Trevor managed to wrench the door open, and we bolted down the hallway, the shadow chasing us. It moved unnaturally, its limbs bending and twisting as it glided through the air. We didn't stop running until we were back on the second floor. The chain was still in place, hanging loosely from the doors, but the shadow didn't follow us down the stairs. "What the hell was that?" Trevor panted, doubling over. "I don't know," I said, trying to catch my breath. "But I'm not going back up there." The next day at school, we agreed not to tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe us? But things didn't go back to normal. That night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound coming from my closet. When I opened the door, it was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Trevor stopped showing up to school a few days later. His parents said he'd gone to stay with relatives, but he never came back. Mark and Allison avoided me, as if being near each other would bring back the shadow. To this day, I don't know what we saw on the third floor. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the metronome's tap 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 in the back of my mind, reminding me of the room we should have never entered. High school is weird enough without strange things happening. It's a time filled with awkward conversations, piles of homework, and a whole lot of trying to fit in. For me, high school was mostly uneventful, until my sophomore year, when something happened that I still can't explain. Our school, Oak Ridge High, was pretty average. It had all the usual quirks of an old building: creaky floors, flickering lights, and rumors of hauntings passed down from one class to the next. Most of these stories were just silly pranks or exaggerated tales, but there was one that stuck with everyone: the legend of Locker 606. According to the story, Locker 606 didn't exist on any of the school's maps. People said it would show up randomly in the hallway, sometimes for a day, sometimes for weeks. It always appeared in different places, and anyone unlucky enough to open it would regret it. No one knew what was inside, but the rumors were endless, everything from creepy notes to missing homework assignments from kids who'd disappeared. There was even a story about a janitor who opened it years ago and quit on the spot, refusing to ever set foot in the school again. Of course, most of us thought it was just a myth. A creepy story to keep freshmen from wandering the halls alone. But one day, I found out the hard way that the legend was real. It started during the third week of October. The air was getting colder, and the hallways were filled with kids talking about Halloween parties and football games. I'd stayed late after school to work on a history project with my friend Claire. The library had just closed, and we were walking to the parking lot when I realized I'd left my phone in my locker. "Go ahead," I told Claire. "I'll catch up." She nodded and headed out the main doors, leaving me alone in the dimly lit hallway. The building always felt different after hours, quieter, almost too quiet. I walked quickly to the freshman hallway, where my locker was located. That's when I saw it. About halfway down the hallway, tucked between two familiar lockers, was one I'd never seen before: Locker 606. My heart skipped a beat. It hadn't been there earlier. I was sure of it. I stood there, staring at it, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I'd never noticed it before. Maybe it was new, or a maintenance locker, or the locker door rattled, just slightly. I froze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. There was no answer. The door rattled again, a little louder this time. I backed up a few steps, my pulse racing. Every instinct told me to walk away, to leave the building and never look back. But curiosity got the better of me. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal handle. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing the inside of the locker. It was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then I saw it, a folded piece of paper lying at the bottom. I hesitated for a moment before picking it up. The paper felt oddly heavy, like it had been soaked in something and left to dry. When I unfolded it, I found a single sentence written in red ink. "It's watching." A chill ran down my spine. Before I could process what it meant, I heard a faint noise behind me, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps coming from the far end of the hallway. I turned quickly, but the corridor was empty. The fluorescent lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move. I slammed the locker shut and ran to the parking lot, my heart pounding. When I reached Claire's car, I didn't tell her what happened. I didn't know how to explain it. Instead, I went home and tried to convince myself it was just a prank, that someone had put the note there to mess with me. But the next day, everything got worse. When I got to school, locker 606 was gone. The space where it had been was now filled with the same dull beige wall as the rest of the hallway. I tried to ask a few classmates about it, but no one had seen anything. Even Claire brushed it off, saying, "You probably just imagined it." That afternoon, I was sitting in math class when I felt it again, that sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was looking at me. As the day went on, the feeling only got stronger. By the time the final bell rang, I was desperate to get out of there. On my way to the parking lot, I passed the science wing. The hallway was empty, the lockers lining the walls like sentinels. And there it was again, locker 606, standing out like a bad memory. I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to keep walking and never look back. But something drew me to it, like a magnet pulling me closer. The door was slightly ajar this time, and as I approached, I heard it, a faint whisper coming from inside. I should have walked away, but instead, I pulled the door open. Inside was another note, folded neatly like the first. My hands shook as I unfolded it. "You let it out." The locker door slammed shut on its own, and I stumbled back, dropping the note. The whispering grew louder, filling the hallway with a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I ran. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the locker, the notes, and the flickering shadows in the hallway. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise outside my bedroom window, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. I didn't dare look. The next day, I begged my parents to let me stay home, but they insisted I go to school. When I got there, everything felt off. The hallways were quieter than usual, and my classmates seemed distant, their faces pale and drawn. As I walked to my first class, I noticed something chilling. Every locker I passed had the number 606 scratched into it, the numbers etched deep into the metal like claw marks. By lunch, the whispers had returned. I could hear them faintly in the background, growing louder every time I walked past a locker. My classmates didn't seem to notice. It was like I was the only one who could hear it. By the end of the day, I couldn't take it anymore. I stayed after school, determined to find the locker and end whatever was happening. I searched every hallway, every wing, but locker 606 was nowhere to be found. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it, the faint tapping, coming from the basement. I'd never been to the basement before. It was mostly used for storage and old equipment, and students weren't allowed down there. But I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. At the bottom, I found it, locker 606, standing alone in the dimly lit space. The whispers were deafening now, the air around me thick and heavy. I hesitated, then yanked the door open. Inside was a mirror, cracked and dirty, its surface reflecting something that wasn't me, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes and a wide, menacing grin. I stumbled back, and the door slammed shut on its own. The whispers stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. The next morning, I transferred schools. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that locker. But sometimes, when I pass by lockers in other buildings, I catch glimpses of numbers scratched into the metal, 606. And I know it's still watching. High school was supposed to be predictable. Sure, there were surprises here and there, pop quizzes, snow days, and the occasional fire drill, but nothing that really broke the routine. That's what made this story so unsettling. It happened during my junior year at Willow Creek High, a place so ordinary it could have been the backdrop for any coming-of-age movie. The hallways were filled with lockers painted in dull gray, the classrooms smelled faintly of marker ink, and the staff was made up of the usual mix of teachers, some nice, some strict, and some that everyone avoided. Then, one day, a new teacher arrived. I was in Mrs. Hathaway's history class when we first heard the announcement. "Students," the intercom crackled, "Mrs. Hathaway will be out for the next few weeks. Please welcome your substitute, Mr. Grayson." The door opened, and Mr. Grayson stepped in. He was tall, thin, and pale, with dark eyes that seemed to scan the room too carefully, as if he were trying to memorize every face. He wore a black suit, slightly frayed at the cuffs, and carried a leather briefcase that looked ancient. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice low and deliberate. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he never blinked, or how his lips curved into a faint, unnatural smile when he spoke. At first, Mr. Grayson seemed like any other substitute, boring, overly formal, and obsessed with maintaining order. But as the week went on, little things started to stand out. For one, he never used the lights in the classroom. He insisted on keeping the blinds half closed, letting in just enough sunlight to cast long shadows on the walls. He also had a strange way of teaching, asking us questions that seemed more like riddles than actual history lessons. "History is more than dates and events," he said one day. "It's about the choices people make, and the consequences they can't escape." I couldn't tell if he was trying to be deep or just creepy. The weirdest thing, though, was how he knew everyone's name by the second day. Subs usually fumbled through roll call, but Mr. Grayson never even glanced at the roster. He'd look directly at each student, saying their name with unnerving confidence. "Michael," he'd say, his eyes boring into mine. "How do you think the past shapes the present?" I'd stammer out some half-baked answer, feeling like he could see right through me. By the second week, things started to get stranger. One afternoon, as we were working on a group project, I noticed something odd. The classroom clock, an old analog one that always seemed to run slow, had stopped completely. Its hands were stuck at 2:13. "Mr. Grayson, the clock's broken," I said, pointing at it. He glanced at it and smiled faintly. "Time moves differently in this room," he said, as if that explained everything. The other students laughed nervously, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't joking. Later that week, I started noticing other things, subtle but unsettling. The air in the classroom always felt colder than the rest of the school, no matter how warm it was outside. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching unnaturally across the walls. And then there were the noises. At first, it was faint, a soft tapping, like fingernails on a desk. But as the days went on, it grew louder and more insistent, as if something were trying to get our attention. One day, while working on an essay, I dropped my pen. It rolled under my desk, and as I bent down to grab it, I froze. Underneath the desk, scratched into the wood, was a single word. "Run." My heart raced as I looked around the room. No one else seemed to notice. Mr. Grayson was at his desk, scribbling something into his notebook. His hand moved so quickly it was almost a blur. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that word. "Run." The next day, I decided to stay after class to confront him. "Mr. Grayson," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "where did you come from?" He looked up from his notebook, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "That's an interesting question, Michael," he said, his lips curling into that faint smile. "But the better question is, where are you going?" Before I could respond, the bell rang, and the other students began to file out. I stayed frozen in place, unsure whether to push further or leave. "You're curious," he said, standing up and closing his notebook. "That's good. Curiosity is the first step toward understanding." He walked past me, his footsteps eerily silent, and left the room. Things escalated quickly after that. The next day, Claire, one of the girls in my class didn't show up. When I asked around, no one seemed to know where she was. Her desk sat empty, and Mr. Grayson didn't even call her name during roll. By the end of the week, 3 more students were gone. "What's going on?" I asked my friend Alex during lunch. He shook his head. "No idea. But something about Grayson freaks me out." We agreed to stick together, but that didn't stop the disappearances. One night, I stayed late at school to finish a project. As I walked past the history classroom, I noticed the door was ajar. The room was dark, but I could see faint light coming from Mr. Grayson's desk. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and approached the desk. His notebook was open, its pages filled with names, our names. Next to each name was a date, and a series of strange symbols that looked like ancient runes. Before I could make sense of it, the door slammed shut behind me. I looked around to see Mr. Grayson standing there, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You shouldn't be here, Michael," he said, his voice calm but menacing. "What are you doing to them?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He tilted his head, studying me like a scientist examining a specimen. "Teaching," he said simply. The air grew cold, and the shadows in the room began to move, swirling around us like living things. I backed away, my hands trembling. "You're not human," I said. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. "Very perceptive," he said. "But it's too late for you now." The shadows closed in, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming pressure, like the room was collapsing in on itself. Just as I thought I was about to black out, the door burst open, and Alex stood there, shining a flashlight into the room. The shadows recoiled, and Mr. Grayson let out a low hiss before vanishing into the darkness. The next day, he was gone. The school claimed he'd left unexpectedly, and Mrs. Hathaway returned the following week. But the students who disappeared never came back. Their desks remained empty, and their names weren't mentioned again. To this day, I don't know what Mr. Grayson was or where he came from. But sometimes, when I pass an empty classroom, I swear I can feel his eyes watching me from the shadows.